All right. Good afternoon. My name is Rick Hawkins, and I lead the IT and OT functions at TimkenSteel. Terrence and Kartik are here with me. They're my business partners from Fujitsu, and you'll get to hear from them here in just a couple of minutes. So what we're going to do here this afternoon is we're going to talk about a little bit about TimkenSteel and who we are, just real quick, just to give you some context. We're going to talk about the challenges that we have faced and a little bit about the lessons that we've learned, and in between a little bit about some of the process that we use to get from addressing our challenges, identifying our targets, and getting to where we are today. We're not done, as you're going to hear along the way, but we've made substantial progress in the last year. So let's start with who we are. TimkenSteel is a maker of what's called small bar quality and seamless mechanical tubing. So we make steel, we make it in bars, and we make it in tubes. We cut it, we machine it into components. We sell those pieces into the automotive industry, defense, energy, and industrial. We're located in Canton, Ohio. We've been making steel there since 1917. So over 100 years of steel making in that location. From an industry perspective, we've got a couple of challenges that we're dealing with. We've been a supplier of steel and components into the internal combustion engine market for a long time. And we're having to figure out how we pivot as the industry moves to electric vehicles. We've also been a supplier into the fossil fuels market for a long time. We're also having to figure out how we pivot to address the move to renewable energy sources. They still need steel, so where are we going to play in that supply chain? So that just gives you a little bit of industry context of where we fit. We're about a $1.1 billion company in terms of our annual sales. We've got just shy of 2,000 employees, probably 60% of which those are operative associates that actually make our steel. So a little bit of context about who we are. So let's switch gears now and let's talk a little bit about the challenge that we face. So about 8.5 years ago, almost 9 years ago, we spun out of a larger company. We're about $1 billion. We're a little larger, $1.5 billion maybe at that point. We spun out of a $5 billion company. We thought when we did that, or at least our leadership thought when we did that, that we would really continue to do what we were doing. We'd been operating as a division of a larger company. We would continue to do that. And what we quickly learned was that was not true. That was not the way the world works. We weren't just going to add a few corporate functions and continue to work. And partially as a result of that and some less than favorable market conditions, we struggled. We didn't make money for the first few years that we were independent. So we struggled. We tinkered with the formula. We tinkered with the formula, and we just weren't getting where we needed to go. In addition to that, we had external pressures that were coming us. ESG, as you probably all are well aware, is becoming an increasing pressure, especially if you're in heavy industry like we are. You've got supply chain issues. The issues in Ukraine messed with our supply chains in terms of some of our raw materials. So we've got all kinds of issues that we're all trying to figure out the profit formula of a company that's highly cyclical. So about just over 2 years ago, we got a new CEO. The board stepped in and said, it's time for a change. And the new CEO came in and said, okay, so we've got to rethink this. We've got 100 years of steel making capability. We've got really smart people. We know steel. We've lived steel for many of our careers. We're in the Midwest. You know, a lot of our people have been there. It's the only place they've ever worked, right? But we don't have what we need to be profitable across a very cyclical industry. So what are we going to do? And one of those challenges was our IT capabilities, which is where I come into the mix. So what did we do? We said, well, we got to step back and we've got to figure out this IT thing. But as we started to figure out the IT thing, we really realized what we were talking about is a digital transformation. And so we started looking around for partners to help us along the digital transformation. And thus my colleagues from Fujitsu, who we reached to help us through that. And they began to think, hey, maybe there's a different way for us to think about it. let's introduce this idea of design thinking, and then we'll get to capabilities planning and some of the other things in a minute of that became part of that process. So what we started to do is we went out to talk to our executives and say, hey, we want to do a digital transformation. What does that mean to you? Digital transformation is a great buzzword. I don't know, there's what, 100 people in this room, probably 100 definitions of what that means. Well, we got the same thing going on across our leadership team. So we needed to understand, before we start building out a plan, we need to understand, what do you mean when you tell us that we need to go through a digital transformation? In addition to that, we'd already been working behind the scenes and formulating an idea of what it meant to move along a digital transformation. And we needed to introduce to the executive team what we called the art of the possible. Not only what do you think it is, but what could we do that across a whole bunch of different dimensions? Because digital's not, well, we're going to go put some cool IT stuff in and it's going to all happen magically in a box somewhere out in the cloud. That's not a digital transformation. So we had to start to get the executives to think about this differently than what they needed to do. What they had done previously. Because we had even for a small organization, we had a pretty complex ecosphere of stuff that we had to manage our way through and be clear about where we wanted to come out at the other end. So this is clearly a journey, right? We didn't just say, okay, what's our digital vision? Okay, let's do it. Let's go get it. We had to take that and we said, okay, here's where I want to be. I know I got to do these things. I got a bunch of white space in between that I got to bridge, right? How do I link the value of the initiatives that I'm doing to the outcomes that I'm looking for? So as we began to address that and crystallize that vision, we also began to introduce the idea of capabilities planning as an organizing principle. Okay, so I want to be easier to do business with. What capabilities do I need to be easier to do business with? And we had strategic initiatives that the executive team had already lined up. How do we take those and say, okay, to be easier to do business with, these are the capabilities that I need. And then decompose those capabilities further down into things that we could actually go tackle. And it's been a journey. I will tell you, it's not been a straight line journey. We've stumbled along the way. We've had to re-strategize. I've had to call Kartik and say, okay, so this is what happened. What do I do now? More than once. And I don't have a staff of enterprise architects, let alone business architects. I have a handful of IT people that are sitting around a room trying to figure out what the heck it is we're going to do. I'm sorry to be so plain spoken, but that's just the way it is. So we've been on this journey for a little over a year now, and we've made some good progress. And let me talk a little bit about what we've been able to do. So this is probably familiar to a lot of you, this idea of I've got a business outcome. We knew what that was. The business had already decided that before we started this. We'd laid out about half a dozen what we call strategic imperatives of things that we had to go do. So then we began to introduce the idea that we needed to break those things down into what are the capabilities that the organization needs to achieve that outcome. Not something they'd really thought about in those terms, but we said, well, these are really the building blocks of the things that we need to go and accomplish, right? I've got to break it down. I can't just become easier to do business with overnight. That actually was one of our strategic imperatives, by the way. And of course, you're all really familiar with the building blocks of the capability is the people, the process, the information, and technology. When we started this, our executives really thought we were just going to address the technology and a bunch of that stuff was going to come along with it. But I've been an IT guy for more years than I care to tell you about. It just doesn't work that way. And you guys of all people know that. You've got to understand, I don't just put in a cool new, I don't just go put in SAP, which is something we're doing, by the way. I don't just go put it in because it costs millions of dollars to do that. And no disrespect, but I got consultants really helping me all over the place and spending a lot of money. But if I don't break that down into a plan and I don't understand that plan, and we'll talk in a second about how we decompose this even a little further, and I don't create those value chains that connect the initiatives that I'm doing to the outcomes, my CFO is going to come to me and say, okay, we gave you all this money. What are you doing? So we begin to introduce this. We had to be careful about how we do that. We'll talk more about that in a minute. And some of the presenters have already talked about this, but we had to be careful because it wasn't just, oh yeah, that's a good thing, we should go do that. That was not the response that we got. It was, I don't understand what you're doing and why you're doing it. And why is IT going to tell the business how to run? Well, I'm not. We're going to work together on this. You're going to decide how the business runs, but we've got to organize this in manageable chunks that draw a clear and bright line from the things that we're doing to the value that we're creating, or a value chain, if you will. So here's what we did. We actually worked from right to left and then left to right on the diagram you see in front of it. We started with our target outcomes, and we said, okay, here's what we want to achieve. We said, well, we can't achieve that in one step. Easy to do business with. What domain are you talking about? Are you talking about the commercial domain? Are you talking about a procurement domain? Except you can fill in the blank for your organization as well as I can. What are the intermediate outcomes that I need to get to? What are the things that I need to accomplish to become easier to do business with? Because by the way, it's probably a multi-year journey. It certainly is for us. What are the capabilities that I need to achieve those intermediate outcomes? And what are the initiatives that I'm going to run to achieve those capabilities, to achieve the intermediate outcomes, to ultimately making progress toward the target outcome? And then how do I play that back to the organization to say, okay, you want to become easier to do business with, here are the initiatives that we're going to run, sequenced in whatever logical fashion works for us as an organization, whether it's capacity, knowledge, capability, etc. And here's what it's going to cost, what it's going to take, the resource commitment it's going to take. But here's the value generation that's going to come from running that initiative. That initiative in itself is not alone going to generate all of that value, but that in combination with other planned activities is going to generate the ultimate value that the executive leadership has defined. So a number of things that we did along the way to achieve these results. One was just some results chain work that we did, and Fujitsu introduced this concept to us. We were tempted to just start in IT, but what became clear to me, and because I've stubbed my toe, ran my head into that wall a number of times, you can't start with IT. You have to start with the business, okay? So in our case, we started with finance and manufacturing. That's what we've done so far. We're going to have to do more. But what is the transformation that needs to go on in those business spaces to get to the IT thing? What's the application transformation that needs to happen? And how do we then leverage that to achieve the capabilities and outcomes that we need unique to IT that, quite honestly, the business doesn't really care about? They just want to know how much it's going to cost. But by mapping that out, we're tying the changes that we need in IT to the value that we're producing in the business, which ultimately leads to the targeted outcomes that the organization has identified. One of the other things that we realized across the way is we didn't really have the enterprise architecture that we needed. And we had a very informal enterprise architecture. And what we uncovered along the way is, not only do I need it to get after the initial gains that we've highlighted in the organization, but because a lot of this is a culture change for us, I needed the discipline of enterprise architecture to sustain those gains over time. Because what would likely happen is in the 2 or 3 year cycle that we're working through, we would achieve those gains. But at some point, there's going to be an event, a leadership change, a market change, or something that's going to tempt us, to vary from that and go back to the way that we used to do business. And the lack of discipline, the lack of clarity between our initiatives and our outcomes. So we needed, from a business and an IT perspective, we needed that architectural foundation and the governance component of that foundation to make sure that we sustain these gains over the long term. Oops, sorry. So We've already talked a little bit about this, but the capability planning was used as a critical component of that. So we're informing the transformation by the capabilities that are needed in the business, in our case, finance and manufacturing. We'll probably end up doing two more. We need to do one in the commercial space and probably in the supply chain space as well. Not probably, we will need to, but this is where we started because we had willing partners to say, okay, what do you need to do? What capabilities does that require? And we began to map all that out to support the rest of the work that we were doing. But one of the other things, and I'll be honest, I was not a fan at the beginning of this. I'm a convert now, but belated to the game, I'm afraid, was it was great to understand where we needed to go. All the things that we've talked about in terms of targeted outcome, intermediate outcomes, et cetera. But did we really understand where we were starting from? What was the current state of affairs? So one of the things that we did that ended up being much more valuable than I expected was process mining. So if you think about it, and I've been doing this IT thing for a long time, that usually means we bring an army of folks in, usually from a consultant. We go and interview a bunch of people and they tell us what they think, how they think the process works, right? And we're lucky if we get that 80% right. Fujitsu came to us and said, no, that's not really how you should do it. We employed some technology to point at our systems and actually map out and play back to the business how our processes worked. And, you know, I told you, we're a relatively small organization. We did this in procurement as a kind of a test as part of our assessment that we were doing initially. And we just mapped out a simple PO process. And we found out that we had 1,300 different ways that we processed a PO. Okay, so it's great to talk about capabilities and all these other things. If I hadn't done that, I wouldn't know that I had 1,300 things that I had to deal with. So the value of process mining was actually to go back to the executive team and said, did you know these things about your organization? Some they did, but when you pointed this thing at our commercial processes and the variation that we saw in our commercial process, and you start telling the supply chain and commercial and manufacturing people what their real on-time delivery is, if you get out of the room alive, first question, they're not happy. But I'm like, okay, guys, this is the data out of the systems. You cannot like it. That's okay. But this is the reality. This is where we're starting from. So when we talk about initiatives and intermediate outcomes and capabilities, understand where you're starting from. And so that you know what the journey might look like to even get to your intermediate outcomes. So again, I was not a fan at the beginning, but you know, we sat down with our executive team a couple of months ago and played back what we had done. And it was the greatest thing in the world. They didn't like what they saw. They knew they had issues, but we were putting facts and detail behind it. It's like, okay, here's the cycle from when the customer calls us to order steel to when we send it. You knew it was long, but I'm now telling you, not only is it X number of days long, but here's the steps and here's where it sits for a very long time. That's not an IT problem. It's not Rick's problem to solve. But as we talk about a transformation in the business, now we know where we're starting from, and we can begin to think about how does that inform the rest of our plans. One of the other things that we did beyond that was just to really do a deep dive value assessment of the application infrastructure that we had. And this is something that, again, Fujitsu brought some tools to the table to help us. We didn't do this on our own. But to really understand not only where am I on the process side, but where I'm on the application side, and where am I going to need to go to get to the end results that we've already specified. So again, this was really just helpful in keeping us moving and keeping up the pace, because they brought some tools and techniques to the table for us to do that. So the end result of all of that was an execution roadmap. So what are the steps that we need to take? When are we going to take them? How much is it going to cost? what people resources are going to be needed to develop these capabilities to execute against the strategic initiatives that we've laid out. We laid it out in two waves. We're almost done with the first wave. We're late, but we're almost done. But we're late. I'll be honest with you, we're late because we're learning along the way. And we also intentionally laid this out so that I would say we probably crawled before we walked, let alone walked before we ran, to say, okay, these are muscles that we have never exercised as an organization. So how do we get into it? How do we understand how to work between Fujitsu and TimkenSteel? One of the things we did is we outsourced support along the way. So we're kind of building the ship as we're sailing it, if you will. But that was our first step. And then we began some of the early transformation efforts with some targeted areas. Finance and HR happen to be two areas where, from an IT perspective, we were in pretty good shape. Finance was in really good shape from a process and a capability perspective, because they have to be, because most of what they do is, we're a publicly traded company, so it's externally dictated to us, like probably many of your organizations. But HR is where we've really learned. Let me just put it that way. As we learn to work, and so, okay, it's great that we've laid all these things out, but how are we really going to execute? And does the business have the buy-in that we need? So I'm hoping by the end of April we'll be done. We put one of the last utilities in just this past weekend. So I'm thrilled about that. We've got another one that's going to go in here in April, and we've got one in the payroll space that is lagging, but that's because it's a lot more complicated than anybody knew, and we've had a lot of knowledge drain as folks have left the organization. But we have a map, we're on it, we're deep into phase 2 planning now. Fujitsu has a proposal on the table for us. We're spending a lot of time with them, understanding it, understanding how it fits into the framework that we laid out at the beginning, and how it maps toward the end goals that we laid out. So let me just kind of wrap this section up with just two thoughts, some key benefits being one. You know, the whole idea that we created business-focused outcomes says, I'm going to get after the IT things that I need to do, but I'm going to do that by solving the business's problems for them and introducing the people, process, and technology changes and information too, which is a huge one for us, along the way to get those targeted business outcomes and solve my issues in IT at the same time. We've established a common language so that we can talk with the business in terms of value, not in terms of, you know, the IT stuff that my team cares about alone. It comes along the way. It's part of the price tag, but we're now able to converse with the business in a language that we all understand. It's not perfect. It still needs work, but we have a really great start. We really have been able to, through the planning and the learnings through our execution, really optimize our execution. You know, time to value is getting much better. And the other piece I would say is just the measurement of value. Did we achieve what we said we were going to achieve? I've been doing this for 30 plus years, and that's always been our struggle is, okay, if maybe you did, maybe you didn't, maybe you can measure, but do you know why you did or didn't? What went wrong? What part of your plan, did you not build a capability? Did you not achieve an intermediate outcome? Why? So we're not to that point yet, but we at least have understanding of how we're going to do that, how we're increasing our time to value or decreasing our time to value, I should say, and measuring it. Ask me in 2025, and I'll tell you about the post-mortem when we're done. Because that's when we're supposed to be done, not because I'm just avoiding it, which I am. But there was another interesting outcome of this that maybe my friends from Fujitsu knew was coming, but I didn't, but as we went through a number of these activities, a lot of the results chain planning and some of the other things that we did, we really began to raise some challenges to the ultimate business model. Okay, so we were in a meeting a couple of weeks ago with the executive team, and we were talking about the future and where we're going and a number of different things. And all of a sudden they're like, "Oh, but that's not where we're going." Well, but that's where you told me we were going. Will the solution still work? Well, in our case, we're fortunate that it will. So we don't have to retool but I think one of the things that you ought to be thinking about if you're going on a similar journey to us is how solid is the business model? How solid are the business objectives? Do you really understand what that means? And oh, by the way, is that really what you want? Because this iterative process of continuing to poke at, okay, what are the outcomes? What are the capabilities we need to get there? What's the people, process, technology, et cetera? As you begin to iterate on that, you may very well challenge the assumptions of your business executives. Little hint, they may not like that. But it's real and it has to be dealt with. And better that it's dealt with in a planning phase than when you get halfway through execution, you've already spent millions of dollars and you stumble across it. Okay. Last slide. For us, maybe for you as well, this was culture change. So we need to call it that. And we need to be upfront about, I heard a number of you speak this morning and talk about how you talk to the business and all the things you're trying to do, but understand ultimately you may be driving culture change in your business. And why is that important? Because now you understand just how big of a mountain you have to climb. It's one thing to say, I'm going to change a process, put in a new IT system or build a capability. You're changing a culture. You're potentially talking about the DNA of your organization. And you can read the stuff across the top. I don't need to read it to you, but I think the stuff at the bottom and a number of the speakers this morning have already talked about this, but be careful about how you talk about business architecture. You may scare people off. They don't necessarily understand it the way that you do. I didn't. You probably still understand it 10 times better than I do, but we struggle with our executives. And we had a false start or two to understand that it was not IT, in our case, coming in and telling how the business was going to run. It was us trying to help the business understand how they're going to function and what capabilities they need to do that. And they're really driving. We're just there to help. Ultimately, it pains me to say this as an IT guy, but the technology is just a tool. And the culture change for us is come and tell me what problem you're trying to solve, not what piece of software you want to install. Because then you can have a conversation about all the other things that we've talked about. Micro dosing, this is my friend Kardic's a term that I've adopted, but do it in small bits and bites. Don't go in and lay out your business architecture plan in a 30 or 40 slide PowerPoint deck, because you're going to get thrown out of it. Okay, unless you're way more advanced in this than we are. Small doses, introduce the concepts in a logical order, allow them to chew on it, and come back and ask you questions, and then take them to the next step. It sounds very linear. It's not. It'll be iterative, but your chance of success dramatically improves. Find a champion. There's probably someone in your organization that what you're trying to do resonates with and has the ability to influence the decision makers in your organization more than you can. Maybe you can too, but there's power in numbers. And if you can get one or two champions that are in the senior leadership in your organization, however you define that, then your chance of success just went way up. For those of you that sit inside your IT organizations, no IT speak. You're going to have to do some of it because you're going to have to tell them what the dollars are for, okay? But keep it to a minimum. Express the value in business terms and say, by the way, here's the things we're going to have to do in IT to achieve that business value. Because we're IT is a support function. OT is a support function. It exists to make sure that the business can execute and make money, or at least in our case. Be proactive. So reach out, get some help, whether it's the guild, whether it's a consultant, whether you're, I think somebody suggested you Google YouTube videos earlier, whatever it is, get some help because it's going to be a better deal for you in the end. Okay, now I'm going to turn it over to my friends from Fujitsu, and they're going to tell you a little bit about some of the things they did with us.
Great, thanks, Rick. Just a quick introduction. My name's Kartik Ravel. I thought I had a booming voice and didn't need a mic. I'll make it more booming now. Kartik Ravel, I'm head of value realization within Fujitsu. And we have a 20-year history in the area of value realization and actually business capability modeling. We've been doing it for more than 2 decades, quite some time, proud to say. Just a quick soundbite on the work that we're doing with Rick and TimkenSteel. Our aspiration, as many of you might have, is to get to a full closed loop system where capability as an organizing principle is embedded in strategy, is ultimately embedded in the architecture planning process, down into the portfolio management process, using some sort of value realization wrapper to see whether the effectiveness of a enhanced or created capability is meeting the needs of the business, and then flowing that back into strategy. So it's a point of view that Fujitsu's developed, and some organizations, believe it or not, have achieved this holy grail, large global companies. So I can certainly confidently say it's not a pretty PowerPoint slide. It's very achievable. And achieving this kind of state gets you to a level of business performance for those of you that are in the private sector to an unbelievable level where you can pivot the organization a lot faster than you ever have been historically, being able to adjust to market demands. So I'd just like to capstone this slide by stating that we feel very strongly that capability ultimately does bridge the gap between strategy and execution, not to the exclusion of value streams for the orthodox members of the team out here. And this concept of outcome-based planning, quantifiable, measurable outcomes. I know it sounds really simple. However, the simplicity, there's an elegance in it to use, to measure and drive the capability by the organization. So again, I really appreciate the opportunity to work with Rick and the TimkenSteel organization, introducing them to these concepts, and most importantly, seeing some incredible value that's being delivered to them in the process. I'm going to have Terrence, head of business architecture, just say a few words also.
Kartik, I just want to echo Kartik's comments in thanking Rick and TimkenSteel giving us the opportunity to co-present a case study. For me, myself, I've been presenting a few case studies in previous summits, but this time it was really deep and the value contribution to business transformation using business architecture proves again to be a very powerful tool. And I just want to expand on Kartik's point of view on capability, outcome, being an organizing principle in the strategy execution journey. And I would like to put it on this two-dimensional canvas, the horizontal one being the strategy execution journey, very typical, very classic. And you have another continuum between business and the technology. So on this canvas, we would argue that business architecture usually play with starting points, strategic course of actions and strategic goals. They come as a pair, right? Business says, we're going to do this, we're going to achieve that, right? That's usually your starting point. And a lot of time we're in the digital transformation space where you have digital visions. I want to put my chat GPT there just in front of whatever I have, blockchain, AI, whatever you do, you have a digital vision, and you really want to decompose that into what's your strategic outcomes by doing that, along with your strategic goals in a course of actions. That's typically your where the business architecture starting point would be. And we argue that in this entire journey, business architecture should stay there and use this concept of capability being the center, outcome being the king. I've heard that saying. I really like it. This concept should be kept along the way throughout the journey. Golden threads throughout the strategy execution journey. So you begin with this vision and outcome, strategic outcome. Then business architects are in the best position to help decomposing that into a more canonical capabilities, and then the outcomes associated with that specific capabilities. Once you get into the portfolio planning, then you are talking about the increments and the roadmap, right? That's another pair. You have increments, how do you sequence them into a roadmap? Then you start guiding the execution, then you're talking about instantiate, operationalize them, and you achieve the immediate outcome that you can measure. Rick has really elaborated that part. And then once you have that in place, you need to measure that. Capability has its own behavior, and what are the benefits you're achieving that will move the organization into towards the outcome. And all of these are in the context of more business side of the planning and IT side of the planning. Business architecture is holding these hands together and really playing this bridging function. So you have to be aware of all these contexts. From business side, there's a lot of, I wouldn't say it's capability outcome pair, but it's really kind of results oriented kind of mapping there. Whatever you do at the business side, you need to be aware of its immediate outcome, whether it's your portfolio analysis and right away you achieve your resource allocation plan on top of that, right? And from IT side, you have a lot of non-functional requirements, which is because you are doing the proper architecture. So business architecture is really sitting in the middle, trying to bridge these two sides, and you stay along with the journey. That's really what I have, and this is kind of having the results oriented thinking throughout the entire journey of digital transformation. And with that, I'm going to hand back to Rick. Just have final thoughts.
I'm going to leave a couple minutes in case there's any questions. So let me just leave you with one final thought. So wherever you are in your journey, I would encourage you to take a hard look at your organizational culture. How ready is your organization to go on the journey that you're trying to go on? And I would encourage you to do that because you're going to need to tailor your approach to where you determine your organization is sitting. Is your culture really rigid? Is it going to be really resistant to the change that you're trying to do? Well, if you think about that up front, then you can brainstorm strategies to deal with that. Are there places where that's more true, less true? Places where because you're going to have to start where you have an opportunity, right? That's what we did. We had some willing partners and we were able to start there. So, and then we were able to craft our approach around that. And again, don't go it alone. There's lots of resources available to you. But I think if you can think about it in the context of the broader culture and your organization's readiness, your chances of success are going to increase. That's it.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you for a fantastic presentation. See a lot of good feedback online as well. So we'll take some questions. We have about 10 minutes. Ruth, there's a lot in the chat. Why don't you take a couple?
Sure, thanks. Do you use skilled value stream mapping, and how do you link that with your process mining?
The value stream has mostly been used in two areas. One is the finance area. One is the manufacturing area. And that is really kind of providing some guidance to the process mining, and the vice versa. Process mining is kind of feeding the next level of information when we try to map the value stream to the capabilities. So we had some iteration toggling the capabilities a little bit to make sure it covers the spectrum of the capabilities needed for that two areas.
On a related note, how did the process mining approach inform strategic goals that were already set, or were the strategic goals a result of the process mining findings?
So the strategic goals were set before we ever started. The way that the process mining informed those or impacted those, we're beginning to really define our starting point and say, okay, here's the challenges that we're going to have to overcome to achieve those strategic goals, because we know where we're starting from. Do you want to add to that, Carly?
I would just add that the strategic goals were quite broad. And what the process mining allowed us to do was very quickly prioritize those business process areas ripe for optimization that would naturally contribute greater value to the strategic outcomes. So that was a really key benefit of process mining: quick analysis, data-driven, focus and prioritize on those core process areas that would either increase top-line revenue through optimization or reduce cost through process optimization.
Rick, as a person who has seen the light, can you tell us what the steps were? We would love to hear your thought process through the overwhelmedness, the denial, then the coming on. And,
The grief cycle?
I think, given the resistance that you can now look back on, you can help us understand what your thought process was, and we can all leverage that.
Yeah, so we could talk for a long time about that, but I think two things that I would say. One, I was probably a doubter, maybe not a resistor. So what I needed was some evidence that this really produced results. And I was at least open-minded enough to give it a chance. So even though, let's take process mining as a good example. I'm like, I don't really know why we're doing this. We know this. Well, we didn't know. And the facts that process mining, brought to the table, and the way that it informed what we were trying to do. And then I just began to put the pieces together and go, okay, maybe this Cardic guy actually knows what he's talking about. So, I think maybe where that's relevant to you guys, and I'm speculating when I say this, is you got to find that person in the organization who maybe isn't a believer, but is open-minded enough to spend some time and some money to see if there's some value here. And I think one of the things we're able to do with our executive team is say, look, if this ends up being a bunch of bunk, this is how we turn the key off and stop spending money and get on to something that actually works for us. So I think in some combination there of the right person and the right structure of your approach, I think you can take that open-minded person on a journey that makes them a convert or a believer. So I hope that helps.
Cool. Ruth, over to you, and then we have a question in the back, and then I'll come in the middle.
Thanks. Did you use the guild reference models as they are, or did you spend time to create your own capabilities to then use in your capability-based planning?
So the Fujitsu folks will have to answer the guild piece because that's not from you. No, I don't use it. But they help me with that. What they did for us is they built a capability model for us that we were then able to work within. They'll have to address how we did that.
So the manufacturing reference model that we use at TimkenSteel was totally inspired by the guild's manufacturing model. And in some cases, we had to toggle it a little bit to be more business friendly. Yeah, that's what we do. So we do have our own version of manufacturing reference model, and we use it at TimkenSteel, and we even revise a little bit based on the terminologies that TimkenSteel use. But it's largely compatible with the guild model.
Yeah, can I just add a quick comment? So I don't want you to pass over what Terrence just said. Their willingness to change terminology to match how we talk at TimkenSteel was a significant event or item in getting business to buy in. Because now we're talking in words that they understand, words that they use in their everyday work. So it sounds like a small thing, but it was actually a big thing.
So from a value realization piece, what was your that you actually measured your value on? Was it on closing capability gaps? Was it on initiatives? How did you measure that value?
Well, we're still in that process because we're only partway through the journey. I think our value proposition understanding is how do we close the gaps that we see around our strategic initiatives? So do those initiatives lead to outcomes which in the one example we've been being on make us easier to do business with? Part of the challenge we have is we don't necessarily have universal agreement about what it means to be easy to do business with. So I got into it with the leader of our commercial organization in a recent meeting about what that means. So, but that's the nature of strategic goals, is they're big and they're broad and so, sorry. So that's the game plan and how we think we'll measure it.
And we'll just go like a couple minutes over. Ruth, one more from you and we'll take one more in the room then.
Sure. Any tips to successfully embed business architecture governance into initiative planning?
I wish I had a magic pill. I don't. I think it's an iterative process as the organization begins to understand what you're trying to do and see the value of it. Once that happens, then the next step, I think, at least in our journey, is to say, okay, now we have to sustain the value, and governance is how we're going to sustain the value. So we have good executive backing to what we're trying to do. My steering committee, if you will, is the 4 members of our executive leadership. So, and I can tell you, we tried this several years ago, 2017. I didn't have that kind of backing, different leadership team, and we failed. So it's where that governance sits in the organization and their understanding not only of value creation, but value sustaining that value.
Rick, great presentation. Thank you guys. Another question about value, and you already explained about the value realization. You guys are working on that. But before the transformations that you show, you had to present that potential value to executives. So how was your approach to present the potential value of this transformation before execution?
You really want me to be honest with you?
Yeah.
It was just payback. It was okay, because understand, we did not, when the executives came to us and said we were going to do this, we kicked it off with a Hackett study. Okay, so guess what it was aimed at? It was all at cost, right? So to take that and say, okay, we're gonna have to go beyond cost. What was a big deal, but that's where we had to start. So, Fujitsu did an assessment for us, came back, made a pitch and said, here's what we can do, here's what it's going to cost, and here's where we think you can get hard dollar savings. And we had to start there with a traditional, CFO version of payback to earn us the right to sit at the table and to start the journey. I wish I had a better answer for you, but that's really how it started for us. We've been able to move beyond that as we've demonstrated value, but that's where we had to start.
Fantastic again. Thank you, gentlemen.
Thank you.